In the dead of winter, when even the wolves stopped howling, a lone figure trudged through the snow toward an abandoned cabin deep within the pines. Her hands were raw, wrapped in torn fabric that used to be part of her husband's coat. Behind her, 3 small children followed silent, pale, their breaths clouding the icy air. They hadn't spoken much since the burial, not since the last shovel of earth fell over his body, sealing their old life beneath the frozen ground of a land that had never truly been theirs. The widow didn't cry. She had no tears left, only a faint determination to find shelter. Before the next storm buried them all alive, the cabin appeared through the mist like a ghost from another time. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the door hung crookedly, groaning when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold, filled with the scent of rot and something older, something that made her hesitate before crossing the threshold. But the night was coming fast, and the children were shivering. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not sure who still listened, and led them inside. There was no firewood, no light except the dim gray that crept through the cracks in the wall. The floor was warped and split in places, and the corners seemed to swallow sound. Still, it was shelter. The widow laid the baby down on her lap, wrapped the others in a worn blanket, and listened to the wind scrape across the windows. Every gust carried the voice of the mountain, moaning like it mourned something lost long ago. They stayed that way for hours, gathered close for warmth. The widow tried to remember the feeling of her husband's voice, his quiet hum when he worked the fields, his laugh when the children played by the river. But the more she tried, the more his memory faded into the whisper of the storm. She didn't notice when she fell asleep sitting upright, her hand resting protectively over the baby's small chest. It was sometime before dawn when she woke to a sound that didn't belong to the wind. At first, it was faint, barely there a rhythm of low murmurs, like distant chanting. She sat up, straining to hear. The children slept soundly beside her, but the sound grew clearer, threading through the silence like a pulse beneath the earth. Prayers. Soft, deliberate, and spoken in a tongue she didn't recognize. The widow froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the cabin. There was no one there, just the dim outline of old furniture and the faint flicker of dying embers in the hearth. Yet the voices continued, coming from below the floorboards. Not one voice, but many, rising and falling in unison, steady and haunting. It sounded like a congregation praying in secret, their words soaked in sorrow. She held her breath and pressed her ear to the wooden planks. The sound was unmistakable now. Men's voices, deep and resonant, echoing from somewhere beneath her feet. She pulled back, clutching her shawl tightly, unsure if she should wake the children or pretend she hadn't heard anything at all. The cabin stood silent for years. She'd been told no one lived here since the war. Some said soldiers had built it when the valley was still wild. Others claimed travelers disappeared near these woods, their belongings found frozen, but their bodies never recovered. The widow tried to steady her breath. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with 3 mouths to feed and no place else to go. She forced herself to think rationally. Perhaps it was the wind echoing through an empty cellar, or water running beneath the ground. She told herself anything that made sense. But then the prayers changed. They grew sharper, faster, as if whoever spoke below was pleading for something. Her baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping his lips. The voices fell silent instantly. The widow sat frozen. The air turned heavy, and for the first time since entering the cabin, she could feel it, the faint vibration through the wood, like footsteps moving just below her. Not human ones, but a shuffle too light, too deliberate, almost as if something unseen was listening from the dark. She reached for the rusted lantern hanging by the door and struck a match. The tiny flame flickered weakly before catching. In its glow, she could see more clearly now the cracks in the floor, the strange markings carved into one of the beams. They weren't letters, at least none she knew. Circles, lines, and a spiral that looked fresh despite the decay around it. Someone had drawn it recently. Her hand trembled as she touched it. The wood was cold, so cold it almost burned her fingertips. She wanted to leave right then, to gather her children, wrap them tight, and vanish into the snow before dawn. But outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters and sending flurries through the cracks. Leaving meant death, and staying meant facing whatever was beneath her feet. The baby began to cry again, louder this time. The sound echoed sharply in the cramped space. The widow rocked him gently, whispering lullabies she barely remembered. Then, as suddenly as it began, the crying stopped, and another sound followed. A creak from the far corner of the room, slow, deliberate, like pressure shifting under the boards. She turned the lantern toward it, her heart hammering. The light quivered across the dusty planks, illuminating nothing but emptiness. Yet the sound came again, closer. One board lifted slightly, as if something beneath it was pushing upward. She gasped and stumbled backward, shielding the children. Her eldest stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The widow pressed a finger to her lips. "Quiet," she mouthed. The board settled again, silent now, almost as if it had never moved. For several minutes, no one breathed. Only the faint hiss of the wind filled the air. The widow kept her eyes fixed on that corner until the first pale light of morning crept through the cracks. By then, the voices had vanished completely, and the cabin stood silent once more. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from below. Or from beyond, she couldn't tell. That day, she tried to pretend nothing had happened. She swept the floor, patched the broken window, and gathered wood from the edge of the clearing. The children played near the doorway, their laughter brief but precious. She wanted them to believe they were safe, that she could protect them from everything, the cold, the hunger, even the strange whispers that haunted the cabin. But every creak of the floor reminded her that safety here was an illusion. Something had stirred beneath them, something that wasn't done speaking. When night fell again, the forest grew darker than before. The moon hid behind clouds, and the snow began to fall in heavy sheets, muffling every sound except the steady crackle of the fire. The widow sat by it, clutching her baby close, her eyes drifting toward the same corner where the board had moved. The children had fallen asleep early, worn out from the cold. Outside, the storm raged like a living thing, and just when she thought exhaustion might finally win, she heard it again, a whisper, faint and mournful, rising from beneath the floor. This time, it spoke her name. The widow sat frozen, her back pressed against the wall, eyes wide in the firelight. The whisper was soft but clear, threading through the creaks of the old wood. It wasn't her imagination this time. It called her name again, slower now, drawn out like a breath that had traveled through years of silence. She didn't move. Even the baby stopped fidgeting in her arms, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the faint hum beneath them. The storm outside drowned the rest of the world, wrapping the cabin in an eerie isolation that made every heartbeat sound louder. Her first instinct was to wake the children and flee into the snow. But where would they go? The valley stretched for miles with nothing but trees and frozen rivers. The nearest town was a half-day's walk, and the last time she'd been there. She'd sold her wedding ring for a sack of flour and the promise of work that never came. This cabin was all she had now. The thought of leaving it in the middle of a blizzard made her feel like she'd be walking straight into death. So she did the only thing she could. She whispered back, "Who's there?" Her voice cracked, barely a sound. The whisper beneath the floor stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. She stared at the floorboards, half expecting them to move again. When nothing happened, she forced herself to breathe and poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the dark. The glow chased the shadows along the walls, and for a brief moment, she convinced herself she had imagined everything. But when she glanced down, she saw the spiral marking again only now. The wood around it looked darker, as if something beneath had burned through to the surface. By morning, the storm had buried the world in white. The widow stepped outside with an axe in her hand, leaving the children inside. The snow reached her knees, cold biting into her legs. She moved slowly toward the tree line to gather what branches she could. The woods were silent, and her own breath seemed too loud. She looked back at the cabin and noticed something strange. There were no tracks leading to it, except her own from the night before. The wind had swept everything clean, as if nothing human had ever crossed that ground. Inside, her oldest girl was sitting by the hearth, holding the baby close. The boy was staring at the floor again. He pointed to the corner where the plank had lifted. "Mama, I heard someone talking," he said quietly. She froze, the axe still in her hand. "When?" she asked. "Before sunrise," he replied. "It was a man. He said he was sorry." She knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. "You were dreaming," she said, but her voice didn't sound convincing, even to her. That afternoon, she explored the cabin. It had 2 rooms, the main space with the hearth, and a smaller back room that smelled of damp earth and time. There was a narrow hatch near the back wall, almost hidden beneath a pile of rotted boards. When she cleared them, she saw an iron ring fixed to the wood, a cellar door. Her breath caught. She pulled at the ring, but it didn't budge. It was frozen shut, sealed by years of neglect. Still, she felt something radiating from it, a kind of stillness that didn't belong to the living. She spent the rest of the day, keeping busy, anything to keep her mind from the sound she'd heard. She cooked a thin stew from the last of the dried beans and melted snow, fed the children, and patched another hole in the wall with an old blanket. As night came, the forest outside turned blue with shadow. The trees looked like sentinels standing guard, and somewhere far off, a coyote cried out. When she returned to the hearth, the firelight caught the spiral again. Glowing faintly, as if reflecting something deep beneath the floor, sleep came uneasily. She dreamt of a church half buried in snow, its bells ringing without hands to pull them. Inside, the pews were filled with soldiers' faces, pale, eyes closed, their lips moving in silent prayer. In the front pew sat a man with a rope around his neck. His eyes opened and met hers. "It's not the cold that keeps them here," he whispered. "It's what they swore before dying." She woke gasping, her skin damp with sweat despite the freezing air. The baby stirred in her arms, and for a moment she thought she saw movement by the hatch. But when she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, she decided to learn more about the place. There was an old trapper's path leading toward the river, and she followed it, hoping to find signs of another cabin or a hunter's camp. She found none, only trees, endless and quiet. On her way back, she stumbled upon something half buried in the snow, an old wooden cross, crooked and weathered. The name carved into it was barely legible, worn down by years of storms. But the date was clear. It matched the winter of the war that had torn through these lands more than a decade ago. The widow brushed away the snow and found more crosses nearby, arranged in a circle. There were 12 of them. She counted twice to be sure. When she returned to the cabin, she found her daughter sitting on the floor again, tracing the spiral with her finger. "Don't touch that," the widow said sharply. The child looked up, startled. "I heard them again," she whispered. "They're praying for the dead." The widow felt her throat tighten. "We don't speak of that," she said. But when she glanced at the floor again, she noticed something she hadn't before, small drops of moisture seeping through the cracks, like condensation, except it wasn't water. It was darker, almost like ink. That night she couldn't sleep. The children were quiet, but she sat awake by the fire, clutching the axe. Every creak in the wood made her flinch. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint pop of the burning logs. Around midnight, she heard it again, the same low chant rising from beneath the floor. Only this time, it wasn't in a foreign tongue. She could understand fragments of it, words about forgiveness, redemption, and a promise broken. She moved closer, holding the lantern near the floorboards, and her heart sank when she saw if the boards were trembling slightly, as if something below was breathing. She wanted to scream, but bit her lip until she tasted blood. The baby began to fuss, restless. She rocked him gently, whispering prayers of her own, words her mother used to say in the old country. The chant below quieted, but she could still feel it like an echo left behind after a sound ends. Her eyes darted toward the cellar hatch again, and a thought crept into her mind that she didn't dare entertain. What if the prayers came from down there? What if the cellar wasn't empty at all? For 3 more days, the pattern repeated. Every night, the whispers returned. Every morning, she found something new, a plank, slightly displaced. a patch of frost forming in the shape of a handprint, small footprints in the snow outside that vanished before the sun rose. The children grew pale and silent, their laughter gone. Even the baby had stopped crying altogether, as if he too could feel the weight pressing down on the house. On the fourth night, she made a decision. She couldn't live another moment wondering what lay beneath her. She would open the hatch. She waited until the children were asleep, the baby nestled safely beside his siblings. Then she crept to the back room, carrying the lantern in one hand and the axe in the other. The metal ring of the hatch was cold enough to sting her skin. She pulled once, twice, then harder. It didn't move. She struck it with the axe handle, and the wood splintered. A gust of cold air burst upward, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. The lantern flickered violently. The flame thinned, as if struggling against an unseen wind. She leaned over the opening, the light casting trembling shadows across the stairs that descended into blackness. The sound returned, louder now, voices overlapping, pleading, their prayers filling the small space like a living thing. She couldn't tell if they were warning her or calling her closer. Her hand shook as she lowered the lantern toward the dark. The air below was heavy and damp, and she thought she saw movement, something pale, like shifting just beyond the light's reach. Her name echoed once more, clear and human this time. She dropped the lantern in shock, watching it tumble into the void and shatter, the flame dying instantly. From the darkness below came a single breath, long and low, like the world exhaling after a long sleep. Then, silence. She stumbled back, clutching her chest, the cold biting through her bones. Behind her, one of the children stirred and whispered, "Mama, who's talking down there?" The widow turned slowly toward the sound of her daughter's voice. But before she could answer, the floor beneath them groaned once. Then again, like something ancient was waking beneath their feet. The night after she opened the hatch, nothing felt the same. The air inside the cabin was heavier, colder, as if the warmth of the fire couldn't reach the corners anymore. The widow sat awake, her hands trembling near the dying embers, watching the shadows twist across the floor. Every small sound felt magnified, the baby's breath, the creak of wood, the faint sigh of wind through the cracks. Beneath it all, she could still hear it, the slow, rhythmic pulse from below, like the steady heartbeat of something buried alive. She told herself it was the wind under the floor, or maybe the roots shifting in frozen ground. But deep inside, she knew better. The next morning, she tried to act as though nothing had changed. She brushed the snow off the roof, mended the fence, and melted ice for water. The children followed her quietly, their faces pale and drawn. The boy, who had once been quick to laugh, barely spoke anymore. The girl clung to her mother's skirt, whispering things under her breath that the widow couldn't understand. Once, when she leaned closer, she realized her daughter was reciting words that didn't belong to any prayer she knew. Soft chants that sounded eerily similar to the voices she'd heard below the floor. When she asked where she had learned them, the girl only looked toward the cabin and said, "They taught me." That night, the wind died completely, leaving the forest so still that even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. The widow put the children to bed and sat by the fire, staring at the hatch. The boards around it looked warped now, like they had been pushed from underneath. She could hear faint scraping sounds, not constant, but enough to make her heart pound every time it came. She thought of nailing the hatch shut, but some part of her knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was beneath that floor didn't need doors or locks to find its way out. When the boy began to talk in his sleep, she knew the house was changing them. His voice took on a tone that wasn't his own, low, steady, almost too calm for a child. "They're waiting," he whispered one night. "They want her to come down." The widow sat frozen, afraid to wake him. She wanted to ask who they were, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. When he finally stirred awake, he didn't remember anything. But he wouldn't look at the floor anymore. A few days later, she decided to walk to the nearest settlement. The journey would take her most of the day, but she needed to see another human face, to ask if anyone knew what had happened in these woods. She left the children at the cabin, warning them not to open the door for anyone. Her daughter asked quietly, even if they knocked from under the floor. The widow froze, but nodded. Especially then. The path through the trees was buried in snow and silent as a graveyard. As she walked, she noticed shapes carved into some of the older pines marks like the ones beneath the cabin. Circles within circles, crossed by thin lines. She tried not to look at them, but they seemed to appear more frequently the farther she went. Halfway down the trail, she came across a broken wagon, its wheels half sunk into the frozen ground. Nearby, the snow was discolored by something dark. She crouched and brushed it away, finding a rusted lantern in what looked like a torn sleeve. The fabric was old, military issue. From the war that had torn through the frontier years ago, she finally reached the edge of the settlement near dusk. Only a few buildings stood there, now an old chapel, a storehouse, and a tavern with boarded windows. She entered the tavern, and the room fell silent the moment she stepped in. A few men looked up from their drinks, their faces hollow and tired. She asked about the cabin in the northern woods, about the prayers, about the strange voices. For a long time, no one answered. Then an older man by the stove spoke, his voice rough and quiet. "You shouldn't be there," he said. "That land was cursed before you were born." He told her that during the war, a company of soldiers had been stationed there. They were ordered to build a fort, but the ground was soft, and they found a network of tunnels beneath it. No one knew who had dug them. The men started disappearing one by one, until only 12 remained. The chaplain among them claimed the tunnels were burial chambers, and the soldiers had disturbed something that wasn't meant to be touched. In their final days, the chaplain and the others sealed themselves underground, singing hymns until their voices went silent. When the war ended, the locals buried the fort under snow and swore never to rebuild there. The widow's hands went cold as she listened. The man looked at her with pity. "If you've opened the ground again, you've invited them back," he said. "They pray because they can't rest." She left the tavern before anyone could stop her. The journey back to the cabin felt longer than before, every step weighed down by fear. By the time she reached the clearing, night had fallen. A faint light flickered through the cracks of the cabin walls. The children should have been asleep. But she heard voices, her daughter's soft whisper, and another deeper tone answering her. She ran to the door and burst inside. The fire was burning, the children huddled near it, but the air felt thick and wrong. Her daughter was kneeling by the hatch, her hand resting on the wood. The boy sat beside her, wide-eyed, staring at the markings that now glowed faintly red. "Mama," the girl said calmly, "they said we don't have to be cold anymore." The widow rushed forward and pulled her away, shouting for her to stop. The moment she did, the fire flared up violently, sending sparks across the room. The floorboards shuddered beneath them. The widow dragged both children toward the far wall, clutching them tightly as the cabin seemed to breathe around them. Then, as quickly as it began, the noise stopped. The fire dimmed back to a flicker. The girl began to cry softly, confused and trembling. The widow held her, whispering that it was over. But she knew it wasn't. Something had been awakened, and it was no longer content to stay beneath the floor. The next day, she found new carvings on the walls, symbols drawn with something dark and sticky. The spiral now appeared on the door and the hearth. She tried scrubbing them clean, but they wouldn't fade. Even the baby refused to look toward the hatch anymore, turning his head away and crying whenever she stepped near it. By evening, she started hearing footsteps outside. Not the wind or animals' real footsteps, pacing slowly around the cabin. She peered through the small window and saw nothing but the faint outline of trees. Yet the sound continued, circling the house, sometimes stopping at the door, sometimes at the back wall. The children clung to her, their small bodies shaking. She stayed awake until dawn, staring at the latch, waiting for it to move. When light finally broke through the trees, she found the snow outside covered in footprints. Not bare, not booted, just impressions too shallow to belong to the living. They led from the woods straight to the door and then vanished. That morning, the boy asked her if the men under the floor were soldiers. She didn't answer, but in her heart, she knew they were. Over the next few days, she grew weaker. The cold sank deeper into her bones, and her thoughts became heavy, slow. The children began to act distant, their eyes glassy, their words short. Sometimes she caught them standing by the hatch, listening. Once she saw the boy whisper something and then nod as if responding to an unseen voice. When she shouted his name, he didn't even flinch. She tried praying, though she didn't know to whom. The words felt hollow in the thick air of the cabin. Outside, the forest seemed to close in, branches heavy with frost bending toward the roof, as though they wanted to bury the house completely. On the 7th night since she opened the hatch, the whispers returned louder than ever, filling every corner of the cabin. The floorboards shook, dust falling from the ceiling. The voices rose together in a desperate chorus, pleading, mourning, demanding. She clutched her children close, covering their ears, but the sound seeped through. Then came the voice she had heard before, the one that spoke her name. Only this time it said something else. You opened the gate. Now you must finish what we began. Da. The widow's heart pounded. The baby cried out, and the fire roared higher, burning blue for a moment. She looked at the hatch, and for the first time, she saw a thin line of light shining through the cracks. It pulsed like a heartbeat, spreading warmth through the frozen air. She felt drawn to it, like something inside her recognized that glow. The children began to cry louder, pulling at her dress, begging her to stay away. But the voice called again, soft and sorrowful, promising an end to the cold, an end to the hunger. Her knees felt weak as she took one step closer, then another, until she was standing above the hatch. The light grew brighter, flooding the room. Her hand hovered over the iron ring, trembling between fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. Behind her, the children screamed, and the light flickered again, dimming for a breath, as if waiting for her choice. Then came the sound she would never forget, the unmistakable noise of footsteps climbing up from beneath the floor, the first step that rose from beneath. The hatch sounded like the crack of old wood, giving way under pressure. The widow froze where she stood, her hand still hovering above the iron ring. The children clung to each other near the wall, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The fire flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls. And the faint humming from below grew louder, layered with whispers that blended like a mournful hymn. She wanted to run, but her feet would not move. Something in her chest fear of fate held her in place as the sound of footsteps drew nearer from the darkness below. The iron ring rattled. The wood beneath it shifted and rose half an inch, just enough for a thin line of light to break through. It wasn't the cold blue light of the moon or a firelight. It was a strange, warm glow, like sunlight filtered through smoke. The widow took a step back, clutching her shawl. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp soil and iron. Every breath burned in her lungs, and she could feel the baby trembling against her chest. The voices beneath the floor had stopped now. Only the faint creaking of the hatch remained, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was beneath was waiting for her permission to come through. The girl began to cry softly. "Mama, don't let them in," she whispered. The widow knelt beside her, holding both children close, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay behind me. No matter what happens, don't move." She turned her gaze back to the hatch. The glow brightened, filling every crack. And for a moment, it felt as if the entire cabin was breathing with its walls, expanding and contracting, the air trembling with each pulse of that strange light. Then came the voice again, the same one that had called her name before, only now it sounded closer, clearer, almost human. "Help us finish what we began." Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice breaking the silence like a whip crack. No answer came, but the light from below shifted, flickering in rhythm with her heartbeat. The boards beneath her feet felt warm now, almost alive. She backed away until her shoulders pressed against the wall. The fire suddenly hissed and went out, plunging the room into near darkness, leaving only the glow from beneath the hatch. The baby started wailing, the sound sharp and desperate in the hollow room. The widow fumbled in the dark for the axe. Her hands shook so violently, she almost dropped it. She gripped it tight and raised it above her head. "Stay back," she cried, not knowing whether she was speaking to the thing below or to her own fear. The hatch jerked again, harder this time. The boards around it splintered, dust falling from the ceiling. The glow flared once more, then dimmed as something pushed against the opening from the other side. It was then she heard the faintest of sounds, chains rattling. Not fast, but steady, like someone moving with deliberate care. A shadow passed under the cracks of the hatch. She could make out a shape, tall and thin, as if a man were standing just beyond the wooden barrier.
Out!
The voice came again, low and broken. You brought the light. Don't turn away now. Her fingers tightened around the axe handle. I didn't bring anything, she said, her voice trembling. You're not welcome here. The floor trembled. The walls creaked. The snow outside began to fall harder, beating against the windows in waves. And through the storm, she thought she could hear faint echoes of the same prayers, voices carried by the wind, chanting in unison, surrounding the cabin. The sound wasn't coming just from beneath the floor anymore, came from everywhere. Inside and out, the boy, who hadn't spoken for hours, suddenly turned toward the door. They're out there too, he said softly. She followed his gaze. Through the small cracks in the wall, she saw faint shapes moving between the trees, dark silhouettes swaying with the rhythm of the storm. They were too tall to be human, yet too still to be animals. The snow around them glowed faintly, as though lit by the same buried light that burned beneath her floor. The widow knew then that she was surrounded. Panic rose like fire in her chest, but something in her refused to give in. She dragged a chair against the hatch, forcing it down, and grabbed every log she could find to stack on top of it. The wood groaned beneath the pressure, but for a moment the noise below subsided. She could hear only the blizzard's howl. She held her children close and whispered, "We'll make it through the night." But the words felt like lies the moment they left her lips. Hours passed. The fire had died completely, and the air turned bitterly cold. Frost gathered on the inside of the windows. The baby had fallen asleep again, but the other two sat wide-eyed, staring at the hatch. Every so often, a faint tap came from beneath, almost gentle, like fingers brushing wood. Then silence again. It happened over and over until she couldn't tell if it was real or the sound of her own heart echoing in her ears. Sometime near dawn, tapping stopped. The widow dared to move closer, the axe still clutched tight. She leaned down and listened. Nothing, only the faint sigh of the wind. She let out a shaky breath and turned toward the fire to relight it. That's when she heard the boy's voice again, low and far too calm. They said they don't mean us harm. Her blood ran cold. Who told you that? She asked without turning. He pointed to the floor. The man with the chain. He said you opened the gate, but you're afraid to step through it. He said if you don't finish it, they'll never stop. She turned slowly, her breath quick and shallow. You didn't speak to anyone, she said sharply. You hear me? No one. But her son's expression didn't change. His eyes were wide, distant, as if he were staring past her. Seeing something she couldn't. He said he knows your name, the boy murmured. And he remembers your husband. The widow's knees almost gave way. She stumbled back, gripping the table for support. You stop, she said, voice shaking. You stop right now. The boy blinked, confusion breaking through his trance. But before she could move toward him, the hatch gave one final shudder. The chair she'd placed on top shifted, sliding an inch across the floor. Then came a deep, groaning sound from the ground below, a rumble that spread through the cabin and out into the earth. As if the land itself had begun to breathe, the girl screamed and covered her ears. The baby started crying again. The widow pulled them to her, shouting words of comfort she didn't believe. Dust fell from the ceiling in soft clouds, and somewhere outside, she heard the sharp crack of a tree splitting under unseen weight. The forest was moving. The snow fell harder, swirling into white walls beyond the windows, until the world outside disappeared completely. The voices rose once more, filling the cabin with their hollow chant. But now, instead of pleading, they sounded almost angry, the rhythm fierce and sharp. The words seemed to press against her skin, vibrating through her bones. She dropped the axe, covering her ears, but it didn't stop the sound. The children huddled beneath her shawl, shaking. The hatch burst open. The light shot upward in a blinding flash, filling the cabin with warmth and fury. The widow screamed as the boards beneath her feet cracked and splintered. The glow revealed the outlines of faces, dozens of them pale, solemn, their eyes shut tight as if still in prayer. The air smelled of ash and earth. From beneath the broken wood, hands reached up not to grab, but to rise, to climb, as if seeking the surface after centuries buried in darkness. The widow stumbled backward, dragging the children away from the growing hole. The baby's cries turned into choked sobs. She looked toward the door, but it was sealed by frost. The window was the same, the glass opaque and frozen solid. There was no way out. The glow filled every corner of the room now, and the voices grew louder, clearer, their words finally taking shape. "Free us." The widow fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how," she cried. "I never meant to open it." The light flickered, pulsing as though it understood. Then, slowly, it dimmed again. The hands beneath the floor withdrew, retreating into the shadows. The voices faded, replaced by a single, hollow breath that seemed to come from all around her. She crawled forward, trembling, and peered into the opening. The light was gone now, but deep within the hole. She saw movement, a faint glimmer, like the reflection of a candle in water. She stared at it, unable to look away. Then she heard it once more. The voice she had feared most, calm and quiet, whispering from below, "You can't keep them buried forever." The fire sparked back to life on its own, flames licking the logs in sudden brightness, and in that light, the widow saw the faint outline of her husband's coat lying near the hearth, though she knew she had buried it months ago. Miles away from here. Her breath caught, her heart racing. Somewhere below, the footsteps began again, climbing closer with every beat of the fire. The footsteps that climbed from beneath the floor grew, fainter with every beat of her racing heart until they stopped completely. The firelight trembled across the cabin walls, throwing shadows that no longer felt their own. The widow stood in the center of the room, gripping the axe so tightly her hands ached, her eyes fixed on the place where the hatch had been. The floor was silent now, but the air still hummed faintly, like something unfinished hung between this world and the one below. She waited, listening, until the quiet became unbearable. The children huddled by the wall, their faces pale and frightened, eyes wide in the flickering light. The baby stirred in his sleep, unaware of the fear that wrapped around them all. She wanted to tell the older two that everything was fine, that the danger had passed, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt dry, and the silence in the room felt too heavy to break. When she finally found the courage to look again, the coat that had appeared by the hearth was gone. Only the faint smell of smoke and damp earth remained, clinging to the air like a warning. At dawn, the storm finally eased. The wind faded into stillness, and light filtered through the cracks in the boards. For the first time in days, the forest outside was visible again, though it didn't look the same. The trees leaned closer, their branches heavy with snow, bending like mourners around a grave. The widow stepped outside, her breath misting in the cold. She half expected to see the same footprints circling the cabin, but the snow was smooth and untouched. It looked almost peaceful. Almost. She turned back toward the cabin and paused. Beneath the front steps, faint lines were carved into the frozen earth circles and crosses, the same markings she'd seen inside. She knelt to touch them, and the ground gave off a faint warmth, as if the earth still remembered what lay buried below. She pulled her hand back quickly and rose, scanning the tree line for movement. The forest was silent. That afternoon, she decided to dig near the edge of the clearing, where the ground dipped slightly. Something told her the truth of what haunted this place wasn't in the cabinet, was beneath the soil. The children stayed near the doorway, watching as she struck the frozen ground with the rusted shovel she'd found behind the cabin. Each blow echoed in the stillness, the sound of metal on earth cutting through the silence like a heartbeat. After the fifth strike, she hit something solid. She brushed away the snow and dirt until the outline of a wooden box appeared, small but heavy. Her pulse quickened as she pried the lid open. Inside lay a bundle of fabric wrapped around a book. The cover was cracked leather, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was cramped but legible. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. Each entry was signed with the same initials, CB. The last few pages told the story of a chaplain who had led 12 soldiers into the tunnels to perform burial rites for the dead after the war ended. But something went wrong. They had uncovered bodies that hadn't decayed, their faces serene, as if they were still at prayer. The men tried to rebury them, but the ground refused to take them back. The final entry read, "The light beneath the earth calls to us still. We prayed for their souls, but I fear it is ours that will not rest." The widow's hands shook as she closed the book. She felt the cold seep deeper into her bones, not from the air, but from understanding. The prayers she had heard were not curses, they were pleas. Those voices weren't trying to harm her family. They wanted release. They wanted to finish what had been left undone. She carried the book inside and set it beside the hearth. The children gathered close, and for the first time since arriving, she told them the truth, that the cabin stood on sacred ground. That long ago, men had been buried beneath it, and that she had disturbed their rest. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying the faint echo of the prayers once more. But they sounded different now, calmer, almost peaceful. She sat by the dying fire and opened the ledger again, turning to the last blank page. Taking a piece of charcoal, she began to write her own entry beneath the chaplain's words, "To those who came before us. May your prayers find their end. May the ground that held you give you peace at last. I ask forgiveness for opening what was meant to stay closed." She didn't know if anyone or anything would hear her, but she had to try. When she finished writing, the baby stirred awake and began to cry softly. She rocked him until he calmed, humming an old hymn she barely remembered. As she did, the air in the cabin grew warmer. The fire flickered once, then steadied, burning strong and bright. For the first time since she arrived, she felt no fear in its glow. The children slept soundly through the night. By morning, the hatch in the back room was gone. The boards had mended themselves somehow, the cracks sealed as if they had never been disturbed. The markings on the walls had faded too, leaving only the faint stains of time. The widow stood over the spot where the hatch had been and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the sun rose weakly over the frozen valley, lighting the snow like glass in the days that followed. She gathered what was left of their supplies and began preparing to leave. The storm had cleared the roads, and though she didn't know where they would go, she knew they couldn't stay. Before leaving, she returned to the clearing where she had found the crosses. One by one, she brushed away the snow and placed a small piece of wood over each grave, whispering a prayer for rest. When she reached the last cross, she noticed something new carved into it, her husband's initials, though she hadn't made them. She smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. "You brought us here to finish it," she murmured. "And we did." That night, before their final sleep in the cabin, she sat by the hearth one last time. The ledger lay closed on the table beside her, the charcoal page still faintly smudged from her writing. The flames danced softly, their light steady and calm. The forest beyond the window stood still, blanketed in snow, untouched by wind. The widow leaned back, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. The years of sorrow and fear slowly giving way to quiet acceptance. When dawn came, she gathered the children, bundled them in blankets, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, but the sky was clear. The cabin stood behind them, small and silent, as though it, too, had finally gone to rest. As they made their way down the trail, the widow looked back one last time. The chimney still smoked faintly, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the window, a man's silhouette, standing tall, hands folded as if in prayer. Then the light shifted, and it was gone. They kept walking until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The path ahead stretched wide and white, untouched. The widow felt the warmth of the sun on her face and held the baby closer. The forest no longer whispered. The air was still. For the first time since winter began, she felt truly alive. She knew she would never return to that place, but she would carry its lesson with her, always that the past never truly rests until it is seen. And forgiveness, once spoken, can silence even the oldest of ghosts as they vanished into the snow-covered hills. The morning wind carried a faint sound behind them, not the cry of spirits, but the echo of a single prayer fading gently into the cold. It was a sound not of fear, but of release. And for the first time, the cabin in the woods stood empty, its silence at peace.